Hello, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Bruce Stokes, who's visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund based in Washington, D.C. He's a great friend of TPN. And Bruce is joining us for this podcast to talk about the upcoming US-EU summit in Washington, D.C. Bruce, hi, and thank you very much for agreeing to share your thoughts with us. And for those who hadn't seen the announcements, President Biden will welcome President Ursula von der Leyen of the Commission, the European Commission, and President Charles Michel of the European Council to the White House for talks. And the summit is set for the 20th of October 2023. So, Bruce, if I can start by asking you an opening question. Why is the summit happening now? And what are they going to talk about?
Well, thank you, Jeffries. It's really an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to be with you all. And I think it's a terribly important time in transatlantic relations. Um, uh, in part, it's happening now because after a number of years when the summits were very irregular, if at all, uh, both Brussels and Washington have attempted to have more of these summits in the Biden administration. We haven't had one every year, but they're trying to put these on a more regular basis. And the realization is that a summit next year may be more difficult because we'll both be in election season. They definitely wanted to get one done this fall while they could. And the meeting will, we assume, focus a great deal of attention on US EU cooperation on Ukraine, hopefully highlighting the fact that the European institutions now provide more funding for Ukraine than does the United States, which is something Americans fail to recognize and need to be, they need to understand this. And given the failure of Congress to approve more aid for Ukraine and the fact that it's going to be a tough fight to get that Ukraine funding through Congress, I think my guess is that both van der Leyen and Biden will want to emphasize the need for Europe and the United States to cooperate on Ukraine. They were expected to announce a deal on steel and aluminum, and possibly one on critical minerals. The scuttlebutt around Washington is that probably neither of those are ready to be announced. That what we're more likely to get is an announcement that we're agreeing on principles and we'll keep talking. We'll see if there can be more progress in that. And hopefully there will be. But people don't seem to be terribly hopeful of that. So that's another piece of what they'll probably talk about. And I'm sure that van der Leyen and Michel are here in part to try to take the temperature of the political mood in Washington because they are aware, as other Europeans and Americans are, that it would appear that Donald Trump is going to be the nominee by the Republican Party president next year, that he's running more or less even with Biden these days. And it's terribly important, as our European listeners know, what the outcome of the US presidential election will be next year because of candidate Trump's antipathy as president against Europe and the potential that a newly elected Donald Trump could again sour transatlantic relations.
Thanks, Bruce. So you mentioned that President van der Leyen is going to be visiting to take the temperature. How is that temperature? You mentioned Trump ahead in the polls, or not ahead in the polls, but kind of credible in the polls at least. But putting it more broadly, what is the mood in Washington and on Europe as we go into the summit? Is Europe a best friend, a friend in need? How would you put it? Is it even a focus of a lot of attention?
Well, I'd say right now, the focus of American attention on Europe revolves, at least official Washington attention, is around cooperation on Ukraine and what role uh, Europe plays vis-a-vis what role the U.S. plays on Ukraine. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs came out with a poll just yesterday showing that 46% of Republicans believe that defending Ukraine should be primarily Europe's responsibility, while only 3% say it should be the US responsibility. Now, a majority, a bare majority, about half, say it should be a joint responsibility. But the fact that nearly half of Republicans say it should primarily be Europe's responsibility is fueling this belief in Congress among Republicans that we've done enough. And there are other polls that show we should do less. A majority of Republicans say we should do less in helping Ukraine. So, and while that's just one small piece of the transatlantic relationship and the issues that we face, it is a very dominant issue in discourse in Washington at this point. Um, a secondary issue is cooperation in dealing with China. And I think, at least among elites and policy people, there is an appreciation that Europe has become much tougher on China at a policy level, that the European public is much more critical of China than it had been in the past. And that makes it easier for the US and Europe to cooperate on China. That said and done, it is the way in which we approach being tougher on China, each of us, still is creating all sorts of friction points. The European furor over the IRA, the European Inflation Reduction Act, has dissipated a bit, but there is still a difference in terms of how tough we are willing to be on China. And what's interesting is there has been little discussion outside of the kind of wonky trade politics circles about the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism that will begin to be phased in by Europe next year, because this is going to cause all sorts of tensions in the transatlantic relationship. And in part, the steel talks are trying to address some of that, steel aluminum talks. But there's a broader issue here about the fact that the United States does not tax carbon and Europe does. And this will become, I think, a major issue next year. And it really is not much of a focus of attention at this point.
Right. So, sticking with those trade and economic kind of irritants, you mentioned the security stuff in China. Thinking about, and you talked about CBAM, you talked about steel and aluminum, and you talked about IRA. We've got a meeting of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council slated for later in the year in December, and that has a fixed agenda and a process, and we can talk about that. But I'm just interested in how the summit will look at some of the issues that may or may not be TTC subjects. So there I'm thinking of that broader digital transformation agenda about AI and the initiatives that are underway on both sides of the Atlantic. Can you see any space for a summit to set up progress or make progress on some of those other topics ahead of the TTC? and to endorse or solidify or strengthen the role of the TTC. Is that something that they'll even talk about?
Well, I think there will certainly be a reconfirmation of our commitment to the TTC because I think the TTC has evolved since its first iteration as a place in which we can talk about a whole range of issues. They keep lengthening the agenda and the various working groups under the TTC. It's and as that, it's a very useful vehicle to say, okay, we have a problem. We're going to set up a working group inside the TTC. We're going to work on this, and so we don't have to fight over it. And so I think the TTC probably will continue after this meeting in December. We should bear in mind that we've had somewhat similar discussion groups in previous administrations that basically died after an administration or two. But I think people understand that short of a broad negotiation like TTIP, where we try to cover all sorts of things, the TTC is a useful mechanism. And it has been supplemented by these one-off conversations about steel or about critical minerals or whatever. And that's probably how we're going to deal with the relationship going forward. Now, whether we will have meaningful announcements about TTC related subjects or AI in particular at the summit, I would be very surprised, frankly. Uh, there, these summits don't tend to get into much detail, and they don't tend to resolve major issues that haven't been teed up by the various bureaucracies. And again, there's no leaks that would suggest that there are major announcements to be made because we've resolved some major issue. So my guess is the summit will say all the right things about cooperation around AI and looking forward to further cooperation in the future and recognize the importance of it, et cetera, without getting into some kind of detailed set of compromises to resolve any differences we have.
Right. We talked about the presidential race ahead, and of course, on the European side next year, there'll be European parliamentary elections, and towards the back end of the year, the election of a new commission, so a new political cycle beginning in Europe and a new political cycle on its way in post November presidentials next year. And we all know that there's fear, and that's a strong word to use, but it's probably true, especially in Europe, that with a President Trump, there could be a return to a more disruptive style of engagement, even turbulence. And there's been thought given to what, if anything, could be done to manage that turbulence, or at least to create or provide guardrails that can keep the core value of the transatlantic relationship on course. What do you think about those efforts, and what's your counsel, if you want, on how those efforts could mature into outcomes and practical ways of trying to help allay those fears of populism in an important institutional relationship like the transatlantic relationship?
I mean, first off, I would totally agree with you. I think what is interesting is that for the last 3 years, when you talk to elites in Europe, they were worried about Trump coming back. More recently, the European Council on Foreign Relations did a public opinion poll, which demonstrated that a majority of European publics were worried about Trump coming back. So there is a looming possibility of a problem here. And we shouldn't rule out the possibility that Trump could become president again. Um, I think that uh, one of the things we should realize is that uh, Americans don't pay much attention to the European political cycles as Europeans pay attention to the American political cycle. And as our European listeners will know much better than our American listeners, um, what happens in the European parliamentary elections, what happens with the European Commission will be terribly important in terms of what happens in transatlantic relations, even if Biden is reelected in the United States. That the center parties that have ruled the European Parliament for years are likely to be weakened. At least that's the current expectation, with the extremes gaining some strength. That may make it harder to get things through the European Parliament on transatlantic relations. And so Americans need to be much more aware of that and prepare for that and try to figure out how to deal with that. That said and done, I think that there are things we could do, could be done at the summit. For example, the Transatlantic Policy Network has recommended some language for the declaration that always comes with these summits, reaffirming past declarations that have been made at summits, but trying to deepen and broaden that cooperation going forward to get some kind of official commitment to each other going forward into 2025, with a deeper involvement of the business community, a deeper involvement of the European Parliament and the US Congress in transatlantic relations, to try as much as humanly possible to better institutionalize this relationship, so that it can weather whatever storms might exist in 2025 and beyond. We don't know what'll be in the declaration, but all these summits always have a declaration. And we certainly at TPN firmly believe that it is not a great reach to reaffirm what we've already committed ourselves to, and to broaden and deepen that based on the experience of the last decades or so, to engage more with a broader community, transatlantic community that has a stake in better transatlantic relations.
Yeah, and that's a great place for us probably to close. As you mentioned, TPN has done some work and you've led that work, and we're really grateful for your leadership on that, around what could be done to strengthen the resilience of the transatlantic relationship. So there's a bit about strengthening delivery out of the TTC. There's a part you mentioned about kind of strengthening that institutional frameworks with declarations, and there's a part about bringing in the legislative and business community. And all of that information I'll shamelessly advertise as being prominently displayed on our website. So please, if anybody's watching this, which will be on YouTube, we invite you to follow up and look at the website and some of our documentation on this topic. But with that, Bruce, let me say it's a great pleasure to be talking with you as always, and thank you both for your time today, but also for your leadership within TPN. It's much appreciated, and thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for the interest, and I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Candy, that's